Welcome to A Slice of Therapy. This podcast was created with Anchor. And if you've not heard of Anchor, let me explain. It's free. It's a really easy way to make a podcast. And it helps me because I can just do this every day directly into my phone, because there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So if you fancy making a podcast too, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. So today I want to have a look at something called constructionism, which is one of them horrible big long words that don't make a great deal of sense when you first encounter it, and certainly didn't to me either. But it's actually really important when it comes to mental health and the way that we think about mental health. And I want to kind of define it because it's a word that you might encounter in this space. And so I want to give you my take on it. You see, there's a number of different schools of thought around issues around emotional well-being. And one of the things that you'll often see is a particular word that's used an awful lot in this space, especially of late, which is the word disorder. And, you know, many people are diagnosed by mental health professionals as having a disorder. And many of these disorders, of course, didn't actually exist, say, 15, 20 years ago, even though the suffering absolutely did exist. But these kind of labels, you have a disorder, are placed upon people as a result of discussions that have been had by mental health professionals who have been trying to kind of categorize, a certain way of understanding a set of symptoms, for want of a better word. And so people with a similar set of symptoms are labelled as having a disorder, and so are kind of bound together in one group. And the reason why constructionism is an important concept is because it allows you to take a fresh look at whether or not the disorder is actually useful for you, especially if you've been diagnosed with one. Now, of course, some people really value having had this disorder diagnosis, and some people find it a real heavy thing to have. It's kind of almost like tattooed upon them. It almost implies that change isn't possible because, after all, they have a disorder. It feels a very static thing, doesn't it? A very stuck thing. And if you're one of those people who don't find the D word, disorder, useful, if it's been pinned upon you, then this might help you just take a different look at it. Of course, if it is useful and it helps you, then fine, like any other set of understandings or ways of looking at things, the key test really is it useful or is it not useful? And so if it's useful for you, then that's fine, that's what's useful is useful. But for many people, it does actually feel more like something that is a limitation. And it's like, oh no, I've got this disorder, so therefore change isn't possible. And so by telling you about constructionism, I want to tell you that change absolutely is possible. In order to best explain this concept of constructionism, it kind of comes from the word construct. And construct basically means things that we've built. So there's a best way of describing this, I suppose, is to draw a line between things that we construct together and things which just exist, whether humans happen upon them or not. So let's give an example. When I go into the shop, amazingly enough, I can hand them a piece of paper. And if it's the right kind of piece of paper, even though the paper itself is inherently worthless, I can hand over a mere piece of paper and walk out with all sorts of stuff. It might be jewellery, or it might be clothing, or it might be food, or it might be an expensive piece of technology. But if I can hand over the right pieces of paper, then it has value. Now, as I say, there's no inherent value in this paper, but the value that comes from it is that we all agree that if it's the right piece of paper, I don't know, like a £100 note, for instance, if it's the right kind of paper, then we all agree that that's a decent exchange. Now, if we stopped agreeing, if we said, like, do you remember when the £5, there was a particular £5 note that went out of existence and nobody would accept it anymore? Suddenly, that £5 note that had all of that value yesterday no longer had it today, simply because we constructed a different agreement between each other about whether or not it had value. And so a mere piece of paper, if we can construct some value around that simply by constructing an agreement. And so that's an example really of constructionism in place. It's a kind of a constructed reality because it wasn't inherently valuable. We just built a value on top of it simply because we all agreed. And in terms of what you might call non-constructed reality, like actual reality, let's say, for instance, let's give an example of that. Let's say there's a particular species of butterfly and it's deep in the jungle where no human has ever been. And yet, even though humans have not yet encountered this species of butterfly, it still exists. Whether or not we're aware of it or not, it still exists. And when we become aware of it, it will be something that we discover rather than something that we create. So the value in money is something that we've created. The value that we placed on that piece of paper is something that we've created. But the butterfly, well, that exists whether we find it or not. But when we do find it, we'll discover it. We won't create it. So you can see the difference there between the two things. There's some things that we kind of together create a reality. And then separately, there's the reality that just exists in the world, whether human eyes ever befall it or not. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is not at all to suggest that suffering is not real. Not at all. What I am saying, though, is that when we come to things like disorders, and of course I'm saying this if you don't want the disorder, and yet some clever professional has pinned it upon you, and so therefore you're thinking it must be true. Disorders are actually an example of that constructed reality. And this is why, in fact, that there are certain disorders that simply didn't exist, say 20 years ago. And what happened is a bunch of mental health professionals sit in a room and they kind of thrash it out. There's not many of them, and they put it in a book. And in that manual, it's got the latest list of disorders, and it changes fairly regularly. They redecide what a particular disorder means. They will abolish certain disorders. They'll create new ones. And so I just want you to understand that in terms of the mental health field, there is a real distinction between what is a creation and what exists, whether we find it or not. And that might just be helpful to you if you're one of those people who don't actually like the disorder. And as I said earlier on, if you're finding the diagnosis helpful, then you find it helpful and that's fine. But for those of you who have had a diagnosis and it's weighing you down, I just want to draw your attention to that reframe, that the disorder is a creation of mental health professionals to describe the suffering that you're actually going through. Now, there are many other ways of describing the suffering that you're going through. And so many mental health professionals and emotional well-being professionals will prefer not to think about disorder, but to think about, say, things like trauma. So we'll think about this thing that might be described as a symptom. Some of us don't describe it and think of it as a symptom at all. We'll think of it as a very understandable response to trauma, which makes sense. So when we do certain things and when we have certain patterns of behaviour, some of us don't think, oh, well, therefore that's a disorder. We'll think of it in a different way and think of it, oh, okay, this is something that makes perfect sense given what that person has been through. So you can see that the suffering is very real, but the way that we think about the suffering is something that's constructed. And so my way of thinking of it is, well, what's happening here makes sense for some reason. And somebody else will think, oh, this is a disorder. But it's helpful, I think, to understand that those disorders have been created by other human beings. And they're simply a way of thinking about your very real suffering. So I hope I can make that distinction make sense. A really good example, though, is what I often describe as the most successful day ever in the history of psychotherapy. And it happened in the 1970s. And this is the amazing thing. There were millions of Americans woke up that day with a mental disorder. And as a result of intervention by psychotherapists, those same millions of Americans went to bed that very same evening without the disorder. And that's remarkable, isn't it? Millions of people wake up with a disorder, and in that one fell swoop, they go to bed at the end of the day without the disorder, all because of an intervention by psychotherapists. And not just any old psychotherapists, but psychotherapists who had never even met the people whose disorder they cleared up. And that's why I describe that as the most successful day in psychotherapy, because millions of people no longer had this disorder. And as I say, this happened in the 1970s. You might be curious about what happened. Well, there was a conference of psychotherapists, and these psychotherapists were in charge of what was classed as a disorder. And they voted that homosexuality, which, incredibly, I know, was once regarded as a mental disorder, they took a vote to decide that it no longer was. And I think that's a really perfect example of how we can construct something. We can construct a label of mental disorder and place it upon somebody. And it's a great example of how constructed it is, because all it took was a vote at a conference, and those people no longer had that disorder at all. So listen, like I say, I've said it a number of times, if you've had a diagnosis and it's helping you and it's something that's really resourceful for you in terms of getting through life, well, that's the best benchmark. If it's useful, then keep hold of it. But for those of you who might be worried about whether you have a disorder or might not want the label, or maybe have been given that diagnosis and you're thinking that you don't want it, remember that the disorders themselves have been made up simply in order to think about what it is that you're going through. Now, what you're going through hasn't been made up. That's your lived experience, and you know that's real. But the disorder labels have been thought up by mental health professionals. Now, you can debate about it and say, well, is this a good idea that this has been done, or is it a bad idea? And people do debate about it. But if you don't like the label, if you don't like the disorder, remember that that disorder was invented by mental health professionals. And over time, just like they did with homosexuality, they'll decide that actually that's not a disorder anymore. So what I want you to take away from this is that there are several ways of looking at the suffering that you're undergoing, looking at the kind of behaviours or belief systems that you want to change. And because there are many different ways of thinking about it, if there is a certain way of thinking about it that is not helpful to you, just reject it. And you can reject a diagnosis of a disorder if it's not useful to you, because what you'll find is that there are many other ways of thinking about your suffering. And so, like I say, one example is to think about your suffering in terms of what I'm doing here makes sense given what I've been through. And so then the work really is to figure out why it makes sense and how to update our beliefs so that we no longer suffer. Now, I'm aware that this might be quite a controversial episode, partly because there are mental health professionals who are really tied to the whole disorder model, partly because many people who are in suffering will have found some of these diagnoses useful. And as I say, anything that's useful is useful and is worth keeping hold of. But it's not the only way of thinking about this stuff. And so if it's not helpful to you, I just want you to be aware of that there are other ways of looking at things. And that's really what constructionism is about. It's about understanding that when we think of our mental health, when we think of our emotional well-being, the ways that we think about it are kind of made up. The ways that mental health professionals think about it are created, are constructed. And what that means is, if you don't like the way a mental health professional is thinking about your suffering, find another one who thinks about it differently. So I hope you found this helpful. And if you have, please share it onwards. And if you'd like to work with me directly, I'm Alun Parry at the Liverpool Psychotherapy practice, which is at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And of course, subscribe to the podcast for free, wherever you get your podcasts, or watch them as videos at asliceoftherapy.com. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another one.